My landlord asked me how chemo was going, but I don't have cancer. I stared at him in complete confusion. Chemo? The landlord looked concerned and said, "Your husband told me about the breast cancer. I know you're going to beat it." He added that was why he hadn't been pushing about rent. My husband Miles was coming up with groceries and his face went white when he saw us talking. He quickly guided me away from the landlord, and I managed to say I needed to rest. I confronted Miles immediately, but he just set down the groceries slowly, not meeting my eyes, and admitted he hadn't paid rent in 6 months. He'd told the landlord I had cancer and we needed the money for treatment. 6 months at $2,000 a month meant $12,000 that should have gone to rent. My mind raced back through all the fake receipts he'd shown me that rent was paid. When I demanded to know where the money went, he admitted he'd lost it gambling, thinking he could triple it for a house down payment. The casino charges he'd claimed were fraud, the weekend construction jobs that paid cash, the nights coming home at 4 in the morning claiming he was helping his brother. All lies covering his addiction. I made Miles show me everything on his phone, and the truth was worse than just the rent money. Our savings account that had held $30,000 for our future was completely empty. The emergency fund we'd spent 3 years building was gone, and the checking account had $17 left. $73,000 total. Gambled away while I'd been working double shifts as a nurse, picking up overtime every week, skipping meals to save money because he said we needed to be careful with spending. The landlord had lost his wife to cancer 3 years ago, which explained why he hadn't pushed for money when Miles told him I was dying. Miles had weaponized a widower's grief to fund his gambling addiction, using the man's personal tragedy as a tool for manipulation. He'd told his entire family I had cancer too, which explained his mother's recent tears during phone calls, his sister dropping off casseroles every week, his brother's sudden offers to loan us money. His coworkers had sent a care package last month and taken up a collection for my medical expenses that Miles had cashed for $500. People who could barely afford their own bills had contributed thinking they were helping a dying woman. He'd created elaborate fiction about treatment schedules, about insurance not covering experimental drugs, about me being too proud to ask for help, all carefully crafted to explain why we were suddenly broke without revealing his gambling. The worst part was he'd used breast cancer, the disease that killed my mother 5 years ago, as his cover story to everyone who asked. He knew what that disease meant to me, how I'd watched her waste away, and he'd turned it into a convenient lie. Now the landlord would want his $12,000 or he'd evict us within 30 days, and Miles had already thought of a solution. He begged me to tell the landlord the treatment worked, that I was in remission, but we still needed time to recover financially from the medical bills. He wanted me to extend his lie, to look our grieving landlord in the face and pretend I'd survived the same cancer that killed his wife. He said the landlord would give us more time if he thought I was recovering, that Miles could get a loan from his parents by saying it was for follow-up care, still using the cancer lie to manipulate everyone's sympathy even after being caught. I stood up and looked around our apartment that we'd certainly lose. 3 years of marriage and building a life together all gambled away at blackjack tables while I thought we were saving for our future, for kids, for something real. Miles followed me to the bedroom, reminding me I had to decide what to tell the landlord who would definitely ask about my treatment again. If I told the truth, we'd be evicted immediately with nowhere to go and no money for a deposit anywhere else. But if I played along with the cancer lie, just for a few months, Miles swore he could fix everything through loans and getting help for his gambling addiction that he was finally admitting existed. I thought about the landlord's sympathetic face, how he'd probably been remembering his wife's final days when he gave us grace on the rent, how he'd left flowers at our door last month with a note about staying strong through the hard times. The eviction would destroy my credit and make it impossible to rent anywhere decent for years. But lying to a widower about having the disease that killed his wife felt like the worst kind of cruelty imaginable. "What are you going to tell him?" Miles asked. I stood there frozen while Miles waited for my answer, my mind racing through everything I'd just learned about our destroyed finances. My mouth opened, but no words came out, and finally I managed to tell him I needed time to think before I talked to the landlord again. Relief washed over his face like I'd just given him hope, but I was already making a mental list of what I needed to do to protect myself from whatever came next. Miles started to reach for me, but I stepped back and walked straight to where he'd left his wallet on the kitchen counter. "What are you doing?" he asked as I grabbed it along with our shared credit cards from the drawer. I didn't answer him, just walked out to my car and locked everything in the glove compartment while he followed me nervously, hovering in the doorway but not daring to physically stop me. He knew he had no right to protest anything I did now. Back inside, I pulled out my laptop and sat at the kitchen table while Miles paced around the living room. I started with our bank accounts, changing every single password while he finally gave up pacing and collapsed on the couch. My fingers shook as I typed new passwords into each account, seeing that $17 balance over and over again in our checking account. The savings showed 0. The emergency fund showed 0. 3 years of careful saving, of me working doubles and skipping lunches, all gone. I changed the passwords for our utilities, our phone accounts, everything I could think of that had online access. Miles tossed and turned on the couch, the leather squeaking every time he moved, but I kept working through every account we had. By 3 in the morning, I couldn't focus on the screen anymore, so I got up and opened every cabinet in our kitchen. I counted cans of soup, boxes of pasta, the half-empty jar of peanut butter, trying to calculate how long we could eat on what we had. Maybe 3 days if we were really careful, 4 if we stretched it. I made a list on the back of an envelope of which bills absolutely had to be paid first. The electricity and my car insurance at the top, the credit cards at the bottom. Miles woke up while I was still writing and immediately launched into his plan for what I should tell the landlord. "Just say you're in remission but still weak from treatment," he said, following me around the apartment. He started throwing out medical terms like neutropenia and maintenance therapy that he must have looked up online, telling me exactly how to make it sound believable. His desperation made my skin crawl, but I just nodded and told him I'd handle it my way. He looked relieved again, probably thinking I was going along with his plan. I had to be at the hospital for my shift at 7, and I'd gotten maybe 2 hours of sleep. I dragged myself through getting dressed, my scrubs feeling heavier than usual, my eyes burning from exhaustion. Miles kept talking about the remission story while I brushed my teeth, suggesting I should say the treatment worked faster than expected. I left without saying goodbye. At work, every single thing reminded me of his lie. I had 3 cancer patients that morning, and looking at their IV ports and their thin arms made me want to throw up. One woman about my age was getting her first round of chemo for breast cancer, and I had to excuse myself to go cry in the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face and went back out, then 20 minutes later had to excuse excuse myself again when her husband held her hand and told her how brave she was. During my lunch break, I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and stared at the concrete wall in front of me. I made a decision right there that felt small but important. I would not lie to the landlord about having cancer. I would not look that man in the eye, knowing his wife died from the same disease and claim I'd survived it. I'd figure out another way to handle this, but I wouldn't add my own cruelty to Miles's. A coworker knocked on my car window, startling me out of my thoughts. "Hey, I heard about your diagnosis," she said when I rolled down the window. She offered to cover some of my shifts so I could focus on treatment, her face full of genuine concern. The shame burned through my chest, and I mumbled something vague about taking things one day at a time, not confirming or denying anything. She patted my shoulder and walked away, probably thinking I was being brave or private about my illness. After my shift ended, I sat in the hospital parking lot and called the bank from my car. I had to know for certain that the casino charges weren't some kind of fraud or mistake, that maybe Miles had been telling the truth about that at least. The representative was cheerful as she pulled up our account history and confirmed that yes, all those charges were legitimate transactions from Miles's debit card at various casinos in the area. She asked if I wanted to dispute them, and I said no, thanked her, and hung up. I drove to a different bank branch across town, one where they wouldn't know me, and walked in with the $20 bill I'd had in my purse. The teller smiled as I opened my own checking account with that pathetic $20, not commenting on the small deposit, though I could see the pity in her eyes. Wonder what Miles was thinking as he watched our landlord's face light up with sympathy every month for 6 whole months? There's something really strange about how he picked breast cancer specifically, knowing about the narrator's mother. That feels like such a calculated choice for someone who's supposed to just have a gambling problem. I called HR from the parking lot and had them redirect my next paycheck to the new account, giving them the routing number while my hands shook. The next morning, I woke up at 5 after barely sleeping and grabbed my laptop to search for free legal aid while Miles snored on the couch. I typed in different combinations of words like tenant rights and eviction help and finally found a website for a nonprofit that offered free consultations. The first available appointment with an attorney named Colette Barr, who specialized in tenant rights, wasn't until tomorrow afternoon, which felt like forever away. I booked it anyway and wrote down the address on a sticky note that I stuck inside my purse where Miles wouldn't see it. My phone showed 17 missed calls from his mother, and I deleted them all without listening to the voicemails. I got dressed for work quietly and tried to slip out without waking Miles, but the landlord was in the hallway checking his mail when I opened our door. He looked up with such genuine concern on his face and asked how I was feeling today and if the new treatment was helping with the side effects. My throat closed up and I managed to tell him I needed 24 hours to discuss our situation properly with Miles before we could talk. He patted my shoulder gently and said, "Of course, take all the time you need," and I could see him remembering his own wife's struggle. I practically ran down the stairs to escape that kindness I didn't deserve. That evening after my shift, Miles was waiting with a whole speech prepared about what would happen if I told the truth. He pulled up websites on his phone showing how evictions stay on your record for 7 years and pointed at listings for apartments in bad neighborhoods. He kept saying we'd both have this on our records forever and asked if I really wanted to live somewhere with break-ins and shootings just to take the moral high ground. His voice got louder as he listed all the places that would reject our applications and how we'd never get approved for a car loan or mortgage. I didn't respond and just went to the bedroom where I stayed up until 3 in the morning reading our lease agreement line by line. The joint and several liability clause was right there in black and white, meaning even if I left him tomorrow, I'd still be responsible for the full $12,000. The eviction would destroy my credit whether I stayed or went, unless somehow the entire debt got paid, which we both knew was impossible. My eyes burned from staring at the legal language, but I kept reading and taking notes on a pad about payment plans and cure periods. At work the next day, I was measuring medications for a patient when my supervisor, Elspeth Blanchard, asked to speak with me privately in her office. She closed the door and gently mentioned that my performance had been slipping lately with several minor errors and missed documentation that wasn't like me at all. She slid an employee assistance program pamphlet across the desk and said they offered free counseling for personal issues that might be affecting work performance. I took the pamphlet and promised to do better, even though I knew therapy couldn't fix having no money and facing eviction. She looked worried, but let me go back to my shift where I tried to focus on my patients instead of the disaster of my life. My phone buzzed during my break with a voicemail notification from Miles's mother that I couldn't ignore anymore. Her voice was thick with tears as she sobbed about how strong I was and how proud she was of me for fighting this terrible disease. She went on about how her grandmother had beaten breast cancer too, and I was going to get through this, and she was praying for me every single day. Each word felt like another brick on my chest, making it harder to breathe, and I had to sit down on a bench outside the hospital. She said Miles had told her about the new treatment plan, and she wanted to come visit to help take care of me, but I should rest and focus on getting better. I deleted the message and went back inside for the rest of my shift, feeling like the worst person alive for letting this go on. The next afternoon, I drove to the legal aid office in a strip mall and met with Colette Barr, who turned out to be younger than I expected, but very direct. She listened without judgment as I explained the whole situation, including the gambling and the cancer lie and the $12,000 we owed. She pulled out forms and templates for payment plan proposals and explained the eviction process step by step, including how long we'd have at each stage. She warned me that judges rarely sided with tenants who were this far behind, but having a payment plan proposal ready showed good faith effort. I took notes on everything she said, and she gave me her card saying to call if the landlord filed formal eviction proceedings, which we both knew was coming soon. When I got home that evening, Miles was on his laptop, and I asked him point blank about the $500 his coworkers had donated for my medical expenses. He closed the laptop slowly and admitted he'd used it for groceries and gas because we needed to eat, and I needed to get to work, didn't I? The casual way he justified spending money people had donated for cancer treatment made me realize I needed to protect myself immediately before things got even worse. I went to the bedroom and quietly gathered my birth certificate from the filing cabinet and my social security card from the drawer where we kept important papers. My passport was in the closet, and my nursing license was framed on the wall, which I carefully removed and put the document in my purse. Miles didn't notice what I was doing because he was staring at his phone where he was apparently researching Gamblers Anonymous meetings and making a list of locations. The next morning, I took all my documents to work and locked them in my locker in the break room where I knew they'd be safe from whatever might happen next. When I got home that afternoon, I stood stood in the doorway and told Miles he had two options: either start attending GA meetings immediately or move out today. He agreed quickly and said he'd already found a meeting for tonight and showed me the screenshot on his phone as proof he was serious. I wondered if he was just saying what I wanted to hear or if he actually recognized how bad things had gotten, but either way, I needed him to try something. The next morning, Miles left for work like nothing had happened, and I waited exactly 10 minutes before I started searching our apartment. I checked his dresser first, pulling out every drawer and feeling behind them, then moved to his side of the closet where I found his old gym bag stuffed behind winter coats. Inside were receipts from the casino dated 3 days ago, after he'd sworn he was done gambling forever. I kept searching and found 3 prepaid debit cards hidden in his sock drawer with about $200 total on them, and the receipts showed they were bought yesterday, right after he'd supposedly hit rock bottom and promised to change. My hands shook as I put everything back exactly how I found it, because I couldn't let him know I was checking up on him yet. That evening after Miles got home, I told him I needed to go talk to the landlord, and he immediately got nervous, asking what I was going to say. I just walked out without answering and knocked on the landlord's door, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. When he opened the door, his face lit up with that concerned smile that made my stomach turn, and I forced myself to speak before I lost my nerve. I told him Miles had a gambling problem, and we were behind on rent but working on a payment plan, and I watched confusion replace the sympathy on his face. He asked about my treatment, and I just stood there unable to say the words about the cancer lie, so I mumbled something about needing to focus on our financial situation first. He said he'd need something in writing soon about the payment plan, and closed the door looking disappointed, like I'd somehow let him down by not dying of cancer. My phone buzzed later that night with texts from Miles at his first GA meeting, sending photos of himself in a church basement with folding chairs arranged in a circle. He said someone named Eugenie Ayers was his temporary sponsor, and she seemed really helpful and understanding about addiction. His messages were full of apologies and promises to change, saying this time was different because he was getting real help. But I'd heard these exact words before when he'd promised to stop staying out late. I spent my next day off at the kitchen table with all the templates Colette had given me, using our one working laptop to draft a payment plan that would take 18 months to pay back the $12,000 we owed. The numbers made me sick because even if I picked up extra shifts every week and Miles got a second job, we'd barely scrape by on ramen and rice for over a year. 2 days later, I heard something slide under our door and found a formal pay or quit notice from the landlord, giving us 3 days to pay the full amount or get out. The legal language was cold and official, nothing like the kind man who'd left flowers at our door, and I realized he was being more patient than the law required since he could have started this process weeks ago. I stared at my phone for an hour before finally texting Miles's sister that her brother had a gambling problem, and I didn't have cancer, asking her please not to tell anyone else yet while we figured things out. Within an hour, my phone was exploding with calls and texts from his entire family, his mother screaming at me for lying to her, his brother demanding to know if Miles was okay, his sister crying about how she'd been praying for me every night. Some were mad at Miles for gambling away our future, but others were mad at me for covering for him and letting them believe I was dying. Miles's mother crying on that voicemail about cancer prayers while I'm sitting outside the hospital makes me question how someone can let a lie grow this huge. Finding those casino receipts and prepaid cards hidden everywhere tells me Miles isn't really trying to change at. At work the next day, Elspeth called me into her office and slid a written warning across the desk, documenting my recent performance issues, including the medication error and multiple instances of being distracted during patient care. She offered to adjust my schedule so I could handle personal matters, and I accepted knowing my job was the only thing keeping us from living in my car. That night, I finally pulled my credit report online using one of the free sites, typing in my information with shaking fingers because I had a bad feeling about what I'd find. The report showed 2 store credit cards opened in my name last month that I knew nothing about, both maxed out at $500 each for electronics and gift cards. This wasn't just lying anymore. This was identity theft, actual fraud using my social security number, and something inside me finally broke looking at those account numbers. I printed out the pages and waited for Miles to get home from work, the papers trembling in my hands as I heard his key in the lock. When I showed him the credit cards, he didn't even look surprised, just said he was planning to pay them off with his next paycheck and didn't think I'd find out so soon. He tried to explain that he'd needed quick cash for groceries and gas, that it was technically our money anyway since we were married, that he would have told me eventually once he'd fixed it. I walked past him to the bedroom and started throwing clothes into an overnight bag while he stood in the doorway watching, asking where I thought I was going to go with no money. I told him I needed space to think about whether I wanted to stay married to someone who would steal my identity and ruin my credit along with everything else. He said it was his apartment too and he wasn't leaving, that I was being dramatic and overreacting to something that could be fixed with a simple phone call to the credit card companies. I grabbed my bag and my purse and walked out while he was still talking, driving to the cheapest motel I could find for $40 a night that I paid with my new debit card from my new bank account. As I pulled into the parking lot of the rundown motel with its flickering neon sign and cracked asphalt, I realized this might be the beginning of the end of our marriage, but I was too tired and broken to care anymore. The motel room smelled like old cigarette smoke and cheap cleaner, but at least it was mine for the night. I sat on the scratchy bedspread with my laptop and started going through every single bank account we shared. First, I removed Miles from the main checking account, which took 20 minutes of security questions. Then I canceled the automatic rent payment that wasn't even working anymore. Next came the utility payments, the gym membership, the streaming services we couldn't afford anyway. Each click felt like cutting another thread between us. My phone rang, and it was someone named Eugenie Ayers who said she was calling from the Gamblers Anonymous meeting Miles had attended. She explained that most gambling addicts relapse in the first 90 days and asked if I wanted to join a support group for spouses. I told her I wasn't ready to sit in a circle and talk about my problems with strangers. She gave me her number anyway and said to call when I was ready. 2 days later, I went back to the apartment to get more clothes and found an official notice taped to our door. The landlord had filed a 3-day notice to quit, which meant we had to pay everything or leave. I took pictures of the notice with my phone and emailed them to Colette, who confirmed this was the last step before court. She said we were running out of options fast. At work the next day, I was counting pills and almost asked my coworker Janet if I could borrow some money. The words were right there in my mouth, but I stopped myself. We'd already taken